Okay, today we're going to talk about World War I, which is an enormous topic, and we have our usual limited time. So what I'm going to have to do is take the existence of the war as a given and not spend the time that I would normally have spent in a Western Civ course going through exactly how it got started and what some of the contributing factors were. Unfortunately, we're going to leave that aside. I feel somewhat better about that with this being an American history series, so that at least I'm not leaving a gaping hole in a strictly American matter. I have some recommended readings for you if you're interested in getting a good overview regarding the causes of the war and the background. And in my own book, I've recommended the excellent work by Hunt Tooley, who has a book called The Western Front, which I think is not the best title for that book, because it really is a book about the whole war. The subtitle is Battleground and Home Front in the First World War. Again, the book is The Western Front by Hunt Tooley. I think that's a very good place to start, and he's familiar with all the modern literature, and he can take you through it, I think, in a very breezy and entertaining and yet still rigorously scholarly way. However, I do want to at least make brief mention of one point, and that is that as time went on, the historical consensus regarding responsibility for the outbreak of World War I shifted. It shifted over time. Initially, in the couple of years following the conclusion of the war, there was some revulsion in intellectual circles in the United States regarding what they considered to be propaganda, American government propaganda, British government propaganda in particular, regarding the outbreak of the war, and you began to get the pendulum shifting such that a good many scholars, like Sidney Fay, for example, began to argue that it was not fair simply to say that the Germans should bear full responsibility for the outbreak of the war. There was obviously plenty of blame to go around, and they gave evidence to support that. Then later, decades later, you had the work of Fritz Fischer, who in effect returned the pendulum back the other way and suggested that in fact the blame lay squarely with Germany and German militarism. And the Fischer thesis was very popular and influential, and there are even some scholars today who will suggest that it really ended the debate, that Fischer really made his case successfully, and that's really the end of it. And in fact, there's some critics of mine who have suggested that I'm just being sort of pig-headed not to accept the Fischer thesis. And it isn't that I accept or reject it. I just point out that there's been a move over time from beginning in around 1919 and then to Fischer and then to today. My point is simply that the apportionment of blame has shifted. I guess I'm to be blamed for pointing out that there are still scholars today who dispute Fischer's thesis. That I have the gall to point out that there are dissenters from the Fischer thesis. I don't think there's anything wrong with pointing that out. It happens to be true. And anybody interested in this, I have a citation for you. If you have internet access, I don't know anybody here, how many of you are on the internet, but there's a good article by Paul Gottfried. It's called "They Were All to Blame," and you can do a good Google search by putting the search term in quotation marks. So if you put Paul Gottfried in quotation marks, you get only results that will have the full name Paul Gottfried in the result. And then in a separate set of quotation marks, I would put "They Were All to Blame," and the article will pop right up. And I think he gives some very good background on this question on Fischer and so on. Now, what we will start off with, we will say, one aspect of the European conflict we will talk about is that, of course, the war itself consists, the major powers involved in it, you have the Allies, who are Britain, France, and Russia, and then later Italy. You have the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, that when the Germans Germans invade France, they do so by marching through Belgium. And in marching through Belgium, they are violating Belgian neutrality. They're violating their own, they're violating a treaty that had existed since the 1830s. And they were dismissing this treaty as a mere piece of paper and going through and marching their troops through. And now I point out that in my book that The Germans had also marched through Luxembourg with no problems, and so again I've had critics say, well, Woods doesn't think it's a very big deal that Germany's marching through Belgium, because shouldn't they have just shut up and behaved the way Luxembourg did? But again, that's obviously not my point. My point is simply to note that although the Germans obviously shouldn't have done this, and although they did behave appallingly at times in Belgium, my point is simply that this is not the greatest atrocity in the history of mankind. And it seems as though the 7 or so people in the United States who still believe that U.S. entry into World War I was a good idea, all 7 of them seem to have gone after me on my treatment of World War I, and they point to Germany's invasion of Belgium. Yes, I understand, but we have to keep some sense of proportion here. Obviously, millions of deaths is not necessarily a rational response to an obvious wrong on Germany's part in this case. And it's also true that the British engaged in what all countries at war in the modern period engage in, which is propaganda. And they obviously exaggerated the behavior of the Germans in Belgium. Now, this isn't to say that the Germans were perfectly well behaved or wonderful people, or you'd want to invite them over for dinner in the course of their passes through Belgium. There are apparently about 5,000 or so deaths in Belgium that are attributable to German troops. So we don't want to say that nothing happened. But the point is that what really the real propaganda coup that the British could claim was to claim that the Germans were engaged in really, really barbaric kinds of atrocities against Belgian civilians. I mean, of a kind that are just hard to fathom. Examples being, for instance, the accusation that German soldiers were just cutting children's hands off for no apparent reason, or tossing babies from one bayonet to another, or raping nuns, or turning dead bodies into margarine, or crucifying soldiers on walls. These types of tales were coming out of Europe and reaching the United States. And my point is simply that these particularly gruesome sorts of things apparently did not happen. And yes, the Germans were brutal in Belgium, but they weren't engaged in this type of just almost absurd 21st century Hollywood style of violence. And that it's precisely these crazy stories that had the propaganda effect of making people think that the Germans were simply evil incarnate and needed to be crushed for the sake of civilization. That's my point, is that it's these stories, not just deaths that occurred. It's the unbelievable brutality, the heinous nature of the crimes is what was all over the Bryce Report in Britain. And this is, by and large, propaganda. I stand by that statement because it happens to be true. Now, but moving on to what really influences the United States, the fact is that the British and the Germans, both of whom were substantial naval powers, although, of course, the British always had as their policy, or by the late 19th century into the 20th, had as their policy that they wanted to have a naval force that was at least twice as large as that of their closest competitor. Naturally, there's going to be an important sea component to the war, and of course, indeed, there was. Now, it needs to be noted that the British engaged in a hunger blockade of Germany that, by the accepted norms of international law at that time, was illegal for a couple of reasons. The first reason was that essentially no one other than Britain, and then by implication the United States, accepted the idea that food could be viewed as contraband and thus subject to confiscation or seizure by a belligerent. In fact, basically, as I say, nobody took that view. The view was that certainly you could prevent the shipment of weapons to your enemy, of course. You don't have to stand by and watch that take place. But otherwise, things like food had to pass, particularly in neutral ships. Neutral ships have the right to trade non-contraband items during time of war. It's a matter of freedom of the seas. So the mere fact of declaring food to be contraband was an innovation, a British novelty. The Scandinavian countries issued a protest against that policy. The United States government chose not to. Secondly, we have the manner in which the blockade was carried out. And here we find a distinction in international law between a close blockade and a distant blockade. In a close blockade, the belligerent would try to stop traffic with its enemy's ports through the measure of stationing ships within about a 3-mile limit, such that if ships were coming into their enemy's ports, well, the British ships standing there, supposing for the sake of argument the British had engaged in a close blockade, a British ship sitting there within the 3-mile range could then stop your ship and search it and see if contraband was there, and if not, it would then let you go, but if so, it would seize it. That was considered legitimate, a legitimate act of war. Not legitimate was a distant blockade. A distant blockade involves simply throwing mines all over the place, and it's called distant because there are no ships there monitoring it. Obviously, a mine can't monitor a ship, can't go on board and search a ship and ascertain exactly what's on board. A mine is an inanimate object, and so it's simply going to blow things up indiscriminately. And that's why it's illegal, because, of course, everybody, regardless of the cargo on board, is going to be indiscriminately blown up by the mines, and this type of peril is dangerous to everybody. It's dangerous to neutrals as well as it is to belligerents. So, on both of these grounds, the British hunger blockade was considered illegal. Now, the British government was more or less pleased by the fact that most neutral countries didn't say much about its policy, and in fact, the British government in effect declared the neutral powers seemed to satisfy themselves with theoretical protest. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president, did make clear from time to time that he wasn't altogether thrilled with the British policy, but that was as far as it went. There were no real repercussions of that. Wilson and those who surrounded him, with the occasional exception, were very pro-British, and they had no intention of holding the British to any serious moral standards. That's very, very clear throughout the war. Now, the Germans struck back, of course, and again, it's not to say that the Germans are justified in killing people who are non-combatants, as indeed they did in the course of their submarine policy. We're not trying to justify any of this. We're simply trying to explain it. And normally you wouldn't have to make this distinction. Any rational person would understand that by explaining why the Germans instituted a submarine policy that we're going to see in a moment, anyone would understand that you simply want to know why, just out of historical curiosity, why did an actor do this? Why did a country's government do something? You're not looking to excuse it or to say that it's wonderful and good, any more than a detective looking for the motive behind a murder is thereby justifying the murder. You simply want to know why people do things. Okay, I mean, today, unfortunately, our country is full of propagandized automatons who believe that anytime you look for a motive, it means you are blaming the victim. Well, no, it means you're a rational person and you want to understand cause and effect relationships and why people do the things they do. The German government announced February 4th, 1915, as a retaliatory measure, that all the waters surrounding Great Britain and Ireland, including the whole of the English Channel, are hereby declared to be a war zone. From February 18 onwards, every enemy merchant vessel found within this war zone will be destroyed, without it always being possible to avoid danger to the crews and passengers. Neutral ships will also be exposed to danger in the war zone, as in view of the misuse of neutral flags ordered on January 31st by the British government, and owing to unforeseen incidents to which naval warfare is liable, it is impossible to avoid attacks being made on neutral ships in mistake for those of the enemy. Now, this reference that we hear in these German words to the misuse of neutral flags, this involves the occasional British practice over time of decorating their ships with the flags of neutral countries in order to shield their own ships from attack and give the impression that their ships are really neutral ships. And eventually, belligerent countries catch on to ruses like this, and the British government is arguing that for that reason, neutral ships may themselves be caught up in a submarine attack simply because there's no real way, given this British policy of disguise, of really being able to distinguish what ships really are neutral. So both the British and then in retaliation the Germans were guilty of violating the freedom of the seas and the rights of neutral countries to engage in trade of non-contraband items even during wartime. Now Wilson did not draw any connection between the German submarine warfare and the British hunger blockade. They were entirely separate in his mind, and you know, there's so many parallels to today in World War I. I'm not even going to point them out. I'll leave them to you folks to observe for yourselves, and we'll certainly hear a great many of them when I read for you at the end a couple of the great anti-war speeches that were delivered in the U.S. Senate. It's quite stunning how little things have changed today, and you know, a lot of times we think our own situation is unique. It's not as unique as we think. I'm doing a project right now, an anti-war project, a book project, and it's quite shocking how similar our own situation is, with the media being complicit in the propaganda stories and the false patriotism and all the rest of it. I mean, there are so many exact parallels here and elsewhere, but that's a story for another time. In any event, Wilson's sympathies were always with the British. When the British violated international law, there was little more than a feeble protest, if that, whereas, on the other hand, the Germans always got a stern lecture and threats. Now, there were incidents involving the British submarine warfare, the German submarine warfare almost immediately that involved Americans. In March, for example, there was a British steamship that was sunk by the Germans without warning, and one American was killed on board that ship. Now, the German captain had given 3 warnings and fired only after a British warship appeared on the horizon. The targeted British ship was also carrying 13 tons of ammunition. But nevertheless, Woodrow Wilson sent a note to the German government and explained that the United States intended to protect American citizens who were sailing on ships flying belligerent flags, so that the United States citizen could in fact sail on board a British ship through a submarine zone and should enjoy immunity there. Now eventually, as we'll see, Wilson's position grows even more extreme, which led officials of the German government to respond, well, are Americans going to be allowed to simply have a picnic on the Western Front? Are they going to be allowed to just take a walk through France in between trenches? I mean, what is that going to be your policy? And then anybody who gets shot there is going to be avenged by the U.S.? I mean, what kind of policy is this? Well, John Bassett Moore was a distinguished professor of international law at Columbia University, and he observed that what most decisively contributed to the involvement of the United States in the war was the assertion of a right to protect belligerent ships on which Americans saw fit to travel, and the treatment of armed belligerent merchantmen as peaceful vessels. Both assumptions were contrary to reason, and no other professed neutral advanced them. And in fact, it's worth noting that what the British policy had been during the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-5, the British policy had been that if you're a British citizen and you are stupid enough to be traveling through a war zone, you do so at your own risk, that the British government is not going to be drawn into war if a British citizen happened to be killed because of his own recklessness. And that's an obvious, sensible position. That was the position that Woodrow Wilson himself adopted during the Mexican Civil War. But now you get this assertion of a right, in effect, of Americans to travel aboard belligerent ships. Now, again, there's so much to be said here. I urge you to read the Tooley book or take a look at the World War I chapter in my own politically incorrect guide to American history that's full of the information that you're not supposed to know. It punctures all the propaganda, so I hope it's of some use to you. But we can't fail to make some mention of the Lusitania, which was the most famous passenger liner in the world at the time. This is May 1915. The German government actually published warnings in major newspapers urging people not to book passage on the Lusitania. The Lusitania was traveling through a war zone, so again, you probably don't want to book passage on it. But at the same time, a lot of people were lulled into a false sense of security on the grounds that British Navy is the greatest in the world. They're certainly not going to allow anything to happen to a major passenger liner like the Lusitania. Lusitania was also a very relatively fast-moving ship. It wasn't like a clumsy and frail, notoriously frail submarine, so it really didn't seem like there was much risk. And so people, in fact, did book passage on it. And what wound up happening, as we all know, is that a German submarine captain fired a torpedo at the target. And now, it so happens, incidentally, the Lusitania was also an auxiliary cruiser of the British Navy. It was not, in fact, armed, as the Germans claimed they thought it was. It was not armed, although it was carrying munitions of war on a passenger ship, which is perhaps an underhanded tactic, one might say. 159 Americans were on board, 124 of whom lost their lives in the Lusitania disaster. And it's a terrible atrocity that, again, no one seeks to excuse. At the same time, it's just simple recklessness, obviously, on the part of the British government and of the cruise line that in effect hosted the Lusitania, to be advertising it and to be engaging in cruises that are following these passages. Obviously, it doesn't excuse the Germans, but I would simply accuse everyone involved of great recklessness. I mean, obviously, if you leave your keys sitting there on the hood of your Mercedes, it's still wrong when somebody steals it, obviously. But it's reckless to do that in the first place. That's a simple point that a reasonable person can understand. Well, the American reaction in a great many newspapers and political circles was very, very intense in response to this. Yet, when you look at the newspapers at the time very closely, very few of them are actually calling for outright war in retaliation for the Lusitania incident. But Woodrow Wilson, again, wants to send a very, very stern message to Berlin, making clear that the United States is not going to tolerate this type of behavior. Now, the Secretary of State in the U.S. was William Jennings Bryan, who tried to hold the scales relatively balanced in viewing both the British and the Germans in the context of World War I. And Bryan was displeased at Wilson's intention to send this harsh note. And he said very bluntly to Wilson, "Why be shocked by the drowning of a few people if there is to be no objection to starving a nation?" So nobody cares that the Germans are being starved, and by the end of the war, at least 750,000 German civilians have died, in effect because of starvation, one way or another, complications involving. 5428. Hello? Hi. Yeah, what's up? Oh, nothing. It's just that I'm in the middle of recording something. No, that's okay. No, it's paused. Okay. Oh, yeah. Sure, I'll talk to her. Okay. Hi, Regina. Are you okay? Oh, well, don't, okay? Can you be good? Are you tired? You a little bit tired? Can you smile? Are you smiling? Please? Thanks. Is everything okay? Good. Who's coming over today? Grandma. Oh, that's fun. Oh, that's great. Well, good. Yeah, I'm at work, sweetie. That's all different ones. Yeah. So, oh, those are good. Oh, you don't like them? Okay. Oh. Well, you're going to go see Grandma? That'll be fun. Oh, maybe next week we'll do the lemonade stand, okay? That'd be great. Okay, now be good now, all right? Okay, I'll see you later. Okay, bye. Miss you. Okay, dear. See you later. Okay, so we're going to resume at 57. Let's see if I can... Now, Bryan had a great many other things to say. He reminded Wilson that, in fact, there had been an agreement accepted by Germany, but that Britain had rejected, that would have ended the submarine warfare in exchange for lifting the hunger blockade. And so he made these points to Wilson, but he became convinced that Wilson and the people around him were not going to view the matter dispassionately, and that there was even he even suspected there was a move perhaps even toward war, or that there were some who would in the administration who would certainly not rule that out or would seriously consider it for reasons that Bryan just thought were frankly trivial. So he ultimately resigned, Bryan, and was replaced by Robert Lansing, who was very pro-British, and that was the end of it. So Wilson is now officially surrounded entirely by yes men. I can't help mentioning what Ralph Rako says about Woodrow Wilson here, because when in late May Wilson did send a note to Berlin, there was a subtle change in the note, because he had earlier said that Americans have the right to travel aboard unarmed merchant ships of belligerent countries. Now he's saying they have the right to travel aboard unresisting merchant ships or unresisting belligerent ships. Well, so in other words, Americans have the right to travel aboard ships that are armed and go through a war zone. So in effect, Ralph Rako says, Wilson's view is that every American in time of war has the right to travel aboard armed, belligerent merchant ships carrying munitions of war through a declared submarine zone. Now, no other neutral power had ever declared that it would abide by a doctrine like this or hold other countries up to it, and much less did they ever go to war over it. But that, in effect, was what Wilson's policy amounted to. And, of course, there's much more. We could go on and on forever on this matter of the submarine warfare, but I've got so much else that I want to share to you that I feel compelled simply to move on. It is worth noting, by the way, though, that, and I put this in my book, that when Lansing comes on as Secretary of State, he makes perfectly clear that the United States, even if occasionally it does protest British war measures, that we really have no interest in seriously discouraging those measures, because if the United States, he said, were ever to enter the war, if the United States ever became a belligerent in the war, then we would want to do these things too. We'd want to starve the Germans too, so we can't protest against it too vocally. I mean, this is just, this is what really happened here. I mean, this isn't in your textbook, but this is what really happened, for heaven's sake. Now, a number of politicians urged Wilson that the right to travel through a war zone on a belligerent ship is not something that they or their constituents really thought was worth losing American lives for. And the American ambassador to Germany even said, "Why should we enter a great war because some American wants to cross on a ship where he can have a private bathroom?" Washington Senator Wesley Jones said that we should keep in view the rights of 99,999,000 people at home, rather than of the 1,000 reckless, inconsiderate, and unpatriotic citizens who insist on going abroad in belligerent ships. Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin said that we should have a policy of warning Americans that they travel at their own risk if they're going to travel aboard a belligerent ship. And we had that policy vis-a-vis Mexico. And he said this is a small sacrifice on the part of the few to preserve the peace of the nation. He says how much less sacrifice it requires for our citizens to refrain from travel on armed belligerent ships. So we're asking a sacrifice with regard to Mexico, people traveling there, but certainly, for heaven's sake, it can't be that big of a sacrifice to ask people, could you please stay off armed belligerent ships heading for Europe? In March 1916, we have the torpedoing of the French steamer Sussex. It looked like a warship. It was painted the way a warship is painted black, and it was not traveling through the routes that the British Admiralty had designated for passenger ships, so the German captain assumed it was a mine layer and fired upon it. The Germans, this was a mistake, certainly. They shouldn't have done it. Woodrow Wilson, at that point, declared an ultimatum to Germany and said that unless the Germans abandoned submarine warfare, the United States would sever diplomatic relations, which is a serious move. And the result was the so-called Sussex Pledge. The German government pledged that they would, although they were not going to abandon submarine warfare altogether, they would not sink enemy merchant ships without warning and without saving the lives of people on board. And in effect, what the Germans are doing here is they're granting enemy merchant ships the opportunity to fire the first shot. They're saying, we won't fire upon them. Now, these merchant ships, as I say, some of them are armed. At times, they've been ordered to ram surfacing submarines when they could split them right in half because they were not designed to be rammed, frankly. But the Sussex Pledge had a condition attached to it, and the condition was that they expected the U.S. president to pressure the British government to lift the hunger blockade, and in effect to act in accord with recognized norms of international law. And of course Wilson accepted the Germans' concession, but with regard to firing on merchant ships and not opening fire on merchant ships, but he rejected the demand that the Germans had made that he make some effort to lift the hunger blockade. So again, this is an obvious double standard at work. It's the same double standard that's at work through the whole war. Well, again, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record here, but there is so much to say on this, and the time is just really running out. I'm going to ask if I could just have a little more time, because what I want to share with you is, I think, so important. You can read in my book about the Gore-McLemore resolution, which is a non-binding resolution introduced into Congress that called upon the president to warn Americans not to travel aboard armed ships, and that, as La Follette had suggested, to instruct them that they do so at their own risk if they do so. And Woodrow Wilson took all the influence he had at his disposal and threw it into defeating this measure. So even a non-binding resolution urging Americans to have some common sense was too much for Woodrow Wilson. And I was interested when I was reading about this subject to note that the German Kaiser, when he would get Wilson's notes to him, Wilson's angry notes, he would scribble things in the margins. And he got a note in late April 1916, and Wilson was appealing to the interests of humanity in his opposition to German submarine warfare, and the Kaiser responded in his little scribbling. He said that humanity means to Wilson the unrestricted right for real or hypothetical citizens of USA to cruise about on hostile and armed merchantmen whenever they like in the zone of war. Whereas, according to Wilson, this is in the German Kaiser's rendering of things, Britain's starvation policy, on the other hand, was absolutely not inhuman in Wilson's eyes, and quite right. Well, January 1917, the German situation is becoming more and more untenable. The starvation blockade is taking a terrible toll on the civilian population. The German military managed to persuade the civilian leadership that it was necessary to engage in unrestricted submarine warfare, just fire on everything, and that probably this would lead the United States to intervene in the war, but the German military was convinced that they could finish off the British before the United States could even get into the war. Now, at this point, of course, if you can imagine being an American ship captain, you're not exactly eager to venture into the war zone because you don't want to be sunk. So what Wilson decided to do was to arm American merchant ships with Navy guns and staff them with Navy crews and instruct them to fire on any surfacing submarine they encountered, and he sent them into the war zone. Well, by the time Wilson called for a declaration of war from Congress in April, 4 such American ships had been sunk. And again, it's not to say that people who died on those ships should have died, or it's a wonderful thing they died, but, well, I mean, what exactly would you think would happen under those conditions? Now, Wilson seems to have believed that if the United States was actually involved in the war, were declared belligerent, that it would have a seat at the peace table and could therefore play a role in helping to construct the peace terms and determine what they would be and come up with a treaty. And that thereby the United States could devise a lasting treaty for Europe, and that he believed that any one of the belligerents would be liable to impose a harsh settlement that would simply provoke hatred and resentment in the defeated parties, and that this would only sow the seeds for future wars, that the United States, because it was, in a certain sense, a disinterested advocate for humanity, could rise above these lesser considerations, nationalistic considerations, and impose satisfactory peace terms. And so, in effect, he is saying that what the United States could bring about was peace without victory. That is to say, peace terms that didn't look to carve up the holdings of the recipient nation, that didn't seek to exploit the defeated country. So Wilson, in fact, has this rationale for arguing that it would be in the United States and world interest for America to be in the war. So when the American ships began to be sunk, Wilson, in fact, goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. Now, some critics of mine have pointed out that we should also bear in mind the so-called Zimmerman note that was issued at this time as well. The Zimmerman note was sent by, it was a communication between German officials and Mexican ones, arguing that if the United States should become involved in the war, that Mexico should become an ally of Germany, and that Germany would then help Mexico to win back some of the territory of the southwestern U.S. that it had lost in the 19th century. And that this note in and of itself is a justification for war, but of course it isn't. The Zimmerman note says if the United States gets involved in the war, then this should be done. Well, if the United States stays out of the war, then this won't be done. So that I don't accept that at all. Now, there's much that can be said about what happened in terms of civil liberties in the United States as a result of the war, what happened to the size and scope of government, and the wartime economic planning that took place, massive economic planning. For those people who believe that war is conservative and peace is liberal or something, liberal in the modern sense, 20th century Hillary Clinton sense, that's simply not true. I mean, almost the entire political left was thrilled with the intervention into the war, absolutely thrilled, for a variety of reasons. One of them was that it would be a great precedent for economic planning in the future, because they knew that the government would seize massive sectors of the economy and run them, and would dictate terms of production to the private sector, would massively increase taxation. All the things that they had hoped for and dreamed of would now come true. So of course they were thrilled with it, absolutely thrilled. The people who were really against it, by and large, were traditional, sort of old-fashioned conservative type non-interventionists, basically. But the left absolutely loved it, absolutely loved it. There were, thankfully, a couple of, I think, useful interesting opponents whose speeches are worth hearing, and I don't think it's wasted time. I think people really need to hear what a couple of these men did say when they protested intervention in the war. And so at some length, I would in fact like to read to you, and then by extension record in the podcast and the MP3 disc that'll come out. I want to record these words because they're so interesting, because they contain eerie parallels to today, and they cut through the propaganda so well, and they reflect all the points that I've been making here, that I think they're worth hearing. Let's begin with the speech by Senator George Norris of Nebraska, because I think people typically, when they think of anti-war speeches connected to World War I, they always think of Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who gives a fine speech, to be sure. But I think, if anything, the Norris's speech is even better. It's in some ways more specific, and I think it's better. So what I'm reading to you are excerpts, and I'm not including, as I read them to you, I'm not giving voice to the ellipses that are scattered throughout. So these are excerpts. But let's start with Norris. He says, "The resolution now before the Senate is a declaration of war. Before taking this momentous step, and while standing on the brink of this terrible vortex, we ought to pause and calmly and judiciously consider the terrible consequences of the step we are about to take. We ought to consider likewise the route we have recently traveled, and ascertain whether we have reached our present position in a way that is compatible with the neutral position which we claimed to occupy at the beginning and through the various stages of this unholy and unrighteous war. No close student of recent history will deny that both Great Britain and Germany have, on numerous occasions since the beginning of the war, flagrantly violated in the most serious manner the rights of neutral vessels and neutral nations under existing international law, as recognized up to the beginning of this war by the civilized world. The reason given by the President in asking Congress to declare war against Germany is that the German government has declared certain war zones within which, by the use of submarines, she sinks without notice American ships and destroys American lives. The first war zone was declared by Great Britain. She gave us and the world notice of it on the 4th day of November 1914. The zone became effective November 5th, 1914. This zone, so declared by Great Britain, covered the whole of the North Sea. The first German war zone was declared on the 4th day of February 1915, just 3 months after the British war zone was declared. Germany gave 15 days' notice of the establishment of her zone, which became effective on the 18th day of February 1915. The German war zone covered the English Channel and the high sea waters around the British Isles. It is unnecessary to cite authority to show that both of these orders declaring military zones were illegal and contrary to international law. It is sufficient to say that our government has officially declared both of them to be illegal and has officially protested against both of them. The only difference is that in the case of Germany, we have persisted in our protest, while in the case of England, we have submitted. What was our duty as a government, and what were our rights when we were confronted with these extraordinary orders declaring these military zones? First, we could have defied both of them, and could have gone to war against both of these nations for this violation of international law and interference with our neutral rights. Second, we had the technical right to defy one and to acquiesce in the other. Third, we could, while denouncing them both as illegal, have acquiesced in them both and thus remained neutral with both sides, although not agreeing with either as to the righteousness of their respective orders. We could have said to American ship owners that while these orders are both contrary to international law and are both unjust, we do not believe that the provocation is sufficient to cause us to go to war for the defense of our rights as a neutral nation, and therefore American ships and American citizens will go into these zones at their own peril and risk. Fourth, we might have declared an embargo against the shipping from American ports of any merchandise to either one of these governments that persisted in maintaining its military zone. We might have refused to permit the sailing of any ship from any American port to either of these military zones. In my judgment, if we had pursued this course, the zones would have been of short duration. England would have been compelled to take her mines out of the North Sea in order to get any supplies from our country. When her mines were taken out of the North Sea, then the German ports upon the North Sea would have been accessible to American shipping, and Germany would have been compelled to cease her submarine warfare in order to get any supplies from our nation into German North Sea ports. There are a great many American citizens who feel that we owe it as a duty to humanity to take part in this war. Many instances of cruelty and inhumanity can be found on both sides. Men are often biased in their judgment on account of their sympathy and their interests. To my mind, what we ought to have maintained from the beginning was the strictest neutrality. If we had done this, I do not believe we would have been on the verge of war at the present time. We had a right as a nation, if we desired, to cease at any time to be neutral. We had a technical right to respect the English war zone and to disregard the German war zone, but we could not do that and be neutral. I have no quarrel to find with the man who does not desire our country to remain neutral. While many such people are moved by selfish motives and hopes of gain, I have no doubt but that in a great many instances, through what I believe to be a misunderstanding of the real condition, there are many honest, patriotic citizens who think we ought to engage in this war and who are behind the President in his demand that we should declare war against Germany. I think such people err in judgment and to a great extent have been misled as to the real history and the true facts by the almost unanimous demand of the great combination of wealth that has a direct financial interest in our participation in the war. We have loaned many hundreds of millions of dollars to the Allies in this controversy. While such action was legal and countenanced by international law, there is no doubt in my mind but the enormous amount of money loaned to the Allies in this country has been instrumental in bringing about a public sentiment in favor of our country taking a course that would make every bond worth 100 cents on the dollar and making the payment of every debt certain and sure. Through this instrumentality and also through the instrumentality of others who have not only made millions out of the war in the manufacture of munitions, etc., and who would expect to make millions more if our country can be drawn into the catastrophe, a large number of the great newspapers and news agencies of the country have been controlled and enlisted in the greatest propaganda that the world has ever known to manufacture sentiment in favor of war. It is now demanded that the American citizens shall be used as insurance policies to guarantee the safe delivery of munitions of war to belligerent nations. This is, editorially, I'll note, a reference to the shipment of munitions of war on board ships carrying American passengers. The enormous profits of munition manufacturers, stockbrokers, and bond dealers must be still further increased by our entrance into the war. This has brought us to the present moment when Congress, urged by the President and backed by the artificial sentiment, is about to declare war and engulf our country in the greatest holocaust that the world has ever known. In showing the position of the bondholder and the stockbroker, I desire to read an extract from a letter written by a member of the New York Stock Exchange to his customers. This writer says, "Regarding the war as inevitable, Wall Street believes that it would be preferable to this uncertainty about the actual date of its commencement. Canada and Japan are at war and are more prosperous than ever before. The popular view is that stocks would have a quick, clear, sharp reaction immediately upon outbreak of hostilities, and that then they would enjoy an old-fashioned bull market such as followed the outbreak of war with Spain in 1898. The advent of peace would force a readjustment of commodity prices and would probably mean a postponement of new enterprises. As peace negotiations would be long drawn out, the period of waiting and uncertainty for business would be long. If the United States does not go to war, it is nevertheless good opinion that the preparedness program will compensate in good measure for the loss of the stimulus of actual war." I'll just pause here and insert my own editorial comment that I and many others have written that, of course, war in general does not provide a stimulus to an economy, and there are logical reasons that it can't, but it does, in effect, produce stimulus for certain targeted sectors. Of that there is no doubt, and it's perhaps no surprise that those sectors typically will be in favor of war. And I know there are people who call themselves conservatives who believe in the free market and understand how the free market works and understand that a lot of times people want subsidies from the government, but they find it impossible to believe that weapons manufacturers would ever have a vested interest in war, or that that there's anybody in the defense sector who would actually want there to be a war, or that there are bankers who would want there to be a war. This all sounds crazy and conspiratorial, when actually it's just simple common sense. I mean, what What doesn't make sense about that? You lend money overseas, you want to see that money repaid, so you want the people you lent the money to be victorious in the war. This is just simple common sense. It doesn't require any conspiracy theory. It's just simple common sense. Well, returning to Norris, here we have the Wall Street view. Here we have the man representing the class of people who will be made prosperous should we become entangled in the present war, who have already made millions of dollars and who will make many hundreds of millions more if we get into the war. Here we have the cold-blooded proposition that war brings prosperity to that class of people who are within the viewpoint of this writer. He expresses the view undoubtedly of Wall Street and of thousands of men elsewhere who see only dollars coming to them through the handling of stocks and bonds that will be necessary in the case of war. To whom does war bring prosperity? Not to the soldier, who for the munificent compensation of $16 per month shoulders his musket and goes into the trench, there to shed his blood and to die if necessary. Not to the broken-hearted widow who waits for the return of the mangled body of her husband. Not to the mother who weeps at the death of her brave boy. Not to the little children who shiver with cold. Not to the babe who suffers from hunger. Not to the millions of mothers and daughters who carry broken hearts to their graves. War brings no prosperity to the great mass of common and patriotic citizens. It increases the cost of living of those who toil, and those who already must strain every effort to keep soul and body together. War brings prosperity to the stock gambler on Wall Street, to those who are already in possession of more wealth than can be realized or enjoyed. Now, carrying on and concluding with Norris here, he says, "We are taking a step today that is fraught with untold danger. We are going into war upon the command of gold. We are going to run the risk of sacrificing millions of our countrymen's lives in order that other countrymen may coin their lifeblood into money. And even if we do not cross the Atlantic and go into the trenches, we are going to pile up a debt that the tolling masses that shall come many generations after us will have to pay. Unborn millions will bend their backs in toil in order to pay for the terrible step we are now about to take. We are about to do the bidding of wealth's terrible mandate. By our act we will make millions of our countrymen suffer, and the consequences of it may well be that millions of our brethren must shed their lifeblood, millions of broken-hearted women must weep, millions of children must suffer with cold, and millions of babes must die from hunger, and all because we want to preserve the commercial right of American citizens to deliver munitions of war to belligerent nations." Let's go now to the speech by Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, senator from Wisconsin, excerpts from that. He begins, "I had supposed until recently that it was the duty of senators and representatives in Congress to vote and act according to their convictions on all public matters that came before them for consideration and decision. Quite another doctrine has recently been promulgated by certain newspapers, which unfortunately seems to have found considerable support elsewhere, and that is the doctrine of standing back of the president without inquiring whether the president is right or wrong. For myself, I have never subscribed to that doctrine and never shall. I shall support the president in the measures he proposes when I believe them to be right. I shall oppose measures proposed by the president when I believe them to be wrong. The fact that the matter which the president submits for consideration is of the greatest importance is only an additional reason why we should be sure that we are right, and not to be swerved from that conviction or intimidated in its expression by any influence of power whatsoever. If it is important for us to speak and vote our convictions in matters of internal policy, though we may unfortunately be in disagreement with the president, it is infinitely more important for us to speak and vote our convictions when the question is one of peace or war, certain to involve the lives and fortunes of many of our people, and, it may be, the destiny of all of them, and of the civilized world as well. If unhappily on such momentous questions the most patient research and conscientious consideration we should give to them leave us in disagreement. Let's see. 2,500. 1,2500. Stumble and go to. If unhappily on such momentous questions the most patient research and conscientious consideration we could give. If, unhappily, on such momentous questions, the most patient research and conscientious consideration we could give to them leave us in disagreement with the President, I know of no course to take except to oppose, regretfully, but not the less firmly, the demands of the Executive. Mr. President, many of my colleagues on both sides of this floor have from day to day offered for publication in the Congressional Record messages and letters received from their constituents. I have received some 15,000 letters and telegrams. They have come from 44 states in the Union. Sorting the 15,000 letters and telegrams by states in that way, that is, according to whether they are pro or anti-war, 9 out of 10 are an unqualified endorsement of my course in opposing war with Germany. It is unfortunately true that a portion of the irresponsible and war-crazed press, feeling secure in the authority of the President's condemnation of the senators who opposed the Armed Ship Bill, have published the most infamous and scurrilous libels on the honor of the senators who opposed that bill. It was particularly unfortunate that such malicious falsehoods should fill the public press of the country at a time when every consideration for our country required that a spirit of fairness should be observed in the discussions of the momentous questions under consideration. Mr. President, let me make a suggestion. It is this, that a minority in one Congress, protesting, exercising the rights which the Constitution confers upon a minority, may really be representing the majority opinion of the country. And if, exercising the right that the Constitution gives them, they succeed in defeating for the time being the will of the majority, they are but carrying out what was in the mind of the framers of the Constitution, that you may have from time to time in a legislative body a majority in numbers that really does not represent the principle of democracy, and that if the question could be deferred and carried to the people, it would be found that a minority was the real representative of the public opinion. And he carries on, the poor, sir, who are the ones called upon to rot in the trenches, have no organized power, have no press to voice their will upon this question of peace or war. But, oh, Mr. President, at some time they will be heard. I hope and believe they will be heard in an orderly and peaceful way. I think they may be heard from before long. I think, sir, if we take this step, when the people today who are staggering under the burden of supporting families at the present prices of the necessaries of life find those prices multiplied, when they are raised 100% or 200%, as they will be quickly, I, sir, when beyond that, those who pay taxes come to have their taxes doubled and again doubled, to pay the interest on the non-taxable bonds held by Morgan and his combinations, which have been issued to meet this war, there will come an awakening. They will have their day and they will be heard. In his message of April 2nd, the President said, "We have no quarrel with the German people. It was not upon their impulse that their government acted in entering this war. It was not with their previous knowledge or approval." Again, he says, "We are, let me say again, sincere friends of the German people, and shall desire nothing so much as the early reestablishment of intimate relations of mutual advantage between us." At least the German people, then, are not outlaws, says La Follette. What is the thing the President asks us to do to these German people, of whom he speaks so highly, and whose sincere friend he declares us to be? Here is what he declares we shall do in this war. We shall undertake, he says, the utmost practicable cooperation in counsel and action with the governments now at war with Germany, and as an incident to that, the extension to those governments of the most liberal financial credits in order that our resources may, so far as possible, be added to theirs. Practicable cooperation with England and her allies in starving to death the old men and women, the children, the sick, and the maimed of Germany. The thing we are asked to do is the thing I have stated. It is idle to talk of a war upon a government only. We are leagued in this war, or it is the President's proposition that we shall be so leagued, with the hereditary enemies of Germany. Any war with Germany, or any other country for that matter, would be bad enough. But there are not words strong enough to voice my protest against the proposed combination with the Entente allies. When we cooperate with those governments, we endorse their methods. We endorse the violations of international law by Great Britain. We endorse the shameful methods of warfare against which we have again and again protested in this war. We endorse her purpose to wreak upon the German people the animosities which for years her people have been taught to cherish against Germany. Sir, if we are to enter upon this war in the manner the President demands, let us throw pretense to the winds. Let us be honest. Let us admit that this is a ruthless war against not only Germany's army and her navy, but against her civilian population as well, and frankly state that the purpose of Germany's hereditary European enemies has become our purpose. Again, the President says, "We are about to accept the gauge of battle with this natural foe of liberty, and shall, if necessary, spend the whole force of the nation to check and nullify its pretensions and its power." That much at least is clear, says La Follette. That program is definite. The whole force and power of this nation, if necessary, is to be used to bring victory of the Entente allies, and to us as their ally in this war. Remember that not yet has the whole force of one of the warring nations been used. Countless millions are suffering from want and privation. Countless other millions are dead and rotting on foreign battlefields. Countless other millions are crippled and maimed, blinded and dismembered. Upon all and upon their children's children for generations to come has been laid a burden of debt which must be worked out in poverty and suffering. But the whole force of no one of the warring nations has yet been expended. But our whole force shall be expended, so says the President. We are pledged by the President, so far as he can pledge us, to make this fair, free, and happy land of ours the same shambles and bottomless pit of horror that we see in Europe today. Just a word of comment more upon one of the points in the President's address. He says that this is a war for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government. And this is La Follette again. In many places throughout the address is this exalted sentiment given expression. But are the people of this country being so well represented in this war movement that we need to go abroad to give other people control of their governments? Will the President and supporters of this war bill submit it to a vote of the people before the declaration of war goes into effect? Until we are willing to do that, it illy becomes us to offer as an excuse for our entry into the war the unsupported claim that this war was forced upon the German people by their government without their previous knowledge or approval. Who has registered the knowledge or approval of the American people of the course this Congress is called upon to take in declaring war upon Germany? Submit the question to the people, you who support it. You who support it dare not do it, for you know that by a vote of more than 10 to 1, the American people as a body would register their declaration against it. In the sense that this war is being forced upon our people without their knowing why and without their approval, and that wars are usually forced upon all peoples in the same way, there is some truth in this statement. But I venture to say that the response which the German people have made to the demands of this war shows that it has a degree of popular support which the war upon which we are entering has not and never will have among our people. The espionage bills, the conscription bills, and other forcible military measures, which we understand are being ground out of the war machine in this country, is the complete proof that those responsible for this war fear that it has no popular support, and that armies sufficient to satisfy the demand of the Entente allies cannot be recruited by voluntary enlistments. Now I want to repeat, it was our absolute right as a neutral to ship food to the people of Germany. That is a position we have fought for through all of our history. The correspondence of every Secretary of State in the history of our government who has been called upon to deal with the rights of our neutral commerce as to foodstuffs is the position stated by Lord Salisbury. He was in line with all of the precedents that we had originated and established for the maintenance of neutral rights upon this subject. In the first days of the war with Germany, Great Britain set aside, so far as her own conduct was concerned, all these rules of civilized naval warfare. According to the Declaration of London, as well as the rules of international law, there could have been no interference in trade between the United States and Holland or Scandinavia and other countries, except in the case of ships which could be proven to carry absolute contraband like arms and ammunition with ultimate German destination. There could have been no interference with the importation into Germany of any goods on the free list such as cotton, rubber, and hides. There could have properly been no interference with our export to Germany of anything on the conditional contraband list like flour, grain, and provisions, unless it could be proven by England that such shipments were intended for the use of the German army. There could be no lawful interference with foodstuffs intended for the civilian population of Germany, and if those foodstuffs were shipped to other countries to be reshipped to Germany, no question could be raised that they were not intended for the use of the civilian population. It is well to recall at this point our rights as declared by the Declaration of London, and as declared without the Declaration of London by settled principles of international law. For we have during the present war become so used to having Great Britain utterly disregard our rights in the high seas that we have really forgotten that we have any as far as Great Britain and her allies are concerned. Great Britain, by what she called her modifications of the Declaration of London, shifted goods from the free list to the conditional contraband and contraband lists, reversed the presumption of destination for civilian population, and abolished the principle that a blockade to exist must be effective.